In the whispered space between Europe and Asia, where two continents lean toward each other across ancient waters, there once stood a city that captured the dreams of the world. Constantinople, a name that rolled like incense through the prayers of millions, that echoed in the war cries of conquerors, that trembled on the lips of merchants counting fortunes made and lost. Here, where the Golden Horn curved like a crescent moon around harbours thick with ships from distant lands, where church bells sang across 7 hills crowned with domes that caught the first light of dawn, 1,000 years of empire breathed its final breath. The stones remember everything, the coronations and the conquests, the silk and the silver, the blood and the beauty. In the silence that follows great falls, in the dust that settles over shattered dreams, the story waits to be told. Listen, and let the wind carry you back to those last days when the world's greatest city prepared to meet its destiny, when the very air trembled with the weight of history turning, when time itself seemed to pause at the edge of forever. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. The story begins not with an ending, but with a beginning that would echo through a millennium. In the year 330 of the Common Era, when the Roman Empire still stretched like a vast tapestry, across the known world, Emperor Constantine the Great stood upon the ancient Greek city of Byzantium and saw not what was, but what could be. The morning mist rose from the Bosphorus, that narrow strait where 2 seas meet and 2 continents almost touch. And in that ethereal light, Constantine envisioned a new Rome, a city that would be the crown jewel of his empire, the bridge between East and West, the eternal symbol of Christian dominion over the earth. Byzantium had been old when Rome was young, its foundations laid by Greek colonists 7 centuries before Christ walked the hills of Galilee. But Constantine saw beyond the weathered stones and crumbling walls of the ancient Greek settlement. He saw harbours that could shelter the navies of the world, hills that could support palaces grander than any in Rome, walls that could stand against the storms of time itself. And so began the transformation that would create Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the new Rome, the queen of cities. The construction consumed the empire's finest craftsmen and artists. From every corner of the Mediterranean world they came. Marble workers from Proconnesian quarries, whose white stone would gleam like snow against the azure sky. Master architects who had learned their craft in the shadow of the Pantheon. Painters whose brushes had adorned the villas of senators, goldsmiths whose work had graced the temples of gods both old and new. For 6 years, the sound of hammers and chisels rang across the 7 hills, while ships laden with treasures sailed into the Golden Horn daily. Constantine plundered the ancient world to beautify his new capital. From Alexandria came obelisks that had watched over pharaohs, their hieroglyphic secrets now decorating Christian forums. From Athens, the bronze serpent column that had celebrated Greek victory over Persian invaders found new purpose in the Hippodrome, where it would witness the cheers of Romans instead of Greeks. From temples across the empire came statues of gods and heroes, their pagan significance transformed by their new Christian context, standing now as mere decoration in a city dedicated to the one true God. The great palace rose like a vision of heaven made manifest in stone and gold. Its halls stretched for miles, connected by covered walkways that allowed the emperor to move unseen through his domain. Gardens cascaded down terraces toward the sea, where fountains played music in the afternoon light, and rare birds from distant lands sang in gilded cages. The imperial apartments were lined with silk from China, purple-dyed fabrics that cost more than a common man's lifetime wages, and floors of the finest marble, polished until they reflected the painted ceilings like still water reflects the sky. But the crown of Constantine's new city was the great church, the Hagia Sophia, though this first incarnation was but a shadow of the architectural marvel that would replace it 2 centuries later. Here, where pagan priests had once offered sacrifices to gods whose names were already being forgotten, Christian liturgy now filled the air with incense and sacred song. The emperor himself had decreed that Constantinople would be a Christian city from its foundation, the first great capital of the world built not for Jupiter or Mars or any of the old gods, but for Christ alone. On May 11th, 330, Constantine stood before the assembled multitudes in the Hippodrome, that vast arena that could hold 100,000 souls, and officially dedicated his new capital. The ceremonies lasted for 40 days, a biblical number chosen to emphasize the sacred nature of the new city. Games and spectacles filled the days. Chariot races where the crowds roared their approval for the blue and green factions, theatrical performances that drew from both Greek tragedy and Roman comedy, gladiatorial contests that even in this Christian city still satisfied the people's appetite for blood and drama. But Constantinople was more than mere spectacle. Constantine had understood what made Rome great, and he ensured his new capital would share those advantages. Free grain was distributed to the citizens, just as it had been in the old capital. Public baths, those temples of Roman social life, rose on every hill. The law courts dispensed justice according to Roman tradition, while the Senate, though possessed of less power than its Roman counterpart, still provided a sense of continuity with the imperial past. The emperor established a new aristocracy for his new city, granting titles and estates to those who would make Constantinople their home. Senators from Rome were enticed eastward with promises of greater influence in the younger capital, while local Greek nobility found their status elevated by imperial favor. A new class of Constantinople patricians emerged, their wealth built on trade and imperial service rather than the landed estates that had sustained Roman aristocracy for centuries. As the decades passed, Constantinople grew beyond even Constantine's ambitious vision. The Golden Horn became a forest of masts as merchants from every corner of the known world brought their goods to the city's markets. Silk from the mysterious lands beyond Persia, spices from India that were worth their weight in gold, amber from the northern seas where barbarous tribes lived beyond the reach of civilization, pearls from the Red Sea that had once adorned Egyptian queens, all found their way to Constantinople's bazaars and forums. The city's position made it the natural gateway between East and West. Caravans that had travelled the Silk Road for months across deserts and mountains found their journey's end in Constantinople's markets, while ships that had braved the storms of the Black Sea or the pirates of the Mediterranean found safe harbor in the Golden Horn. The customs duties alone made the imperial treasury rich beyond measure, while the citizens of Constantinople grew, prosperous as middlemen in the world's commerce. By the end of the 4th century, Constantinople had become what Constantine had dreamed it would be, a worthy rival to Rome itself. When the empire was formally divided between East and West in 395, Constantinople became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, inheriting the full majesty and authority of imperial power. The city that had been born as Constantine's vision had become the center of a realm that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of Armenia to the olive groves of Sicily. The emperors who followed Constantine continued to embellish the city, each adding their own monuments to its grandeur. Theodosius brought the great obelisk from Karnak, that ancient monument to Egyptian power, now serving to glorify Christian emperors in the Hippodrome. Theodosius II built the massive land walls that would protect the city for 1,000 years, their triple line of fortifications making Constantinople the most impregnable city in the world. Justinian would later rebuild the Hagia Sophia as the greatest church in Christendom. But even in these early centuries, Constantinople had established itself as the most magnificent city on earth. The streets of Constantinople in those golden, early days were alive with the sounds of empire. In the morning, the workshops of artisans rang with the sound of hammers shaping gold into jewelry fit for emperors. The silk weavers worked at their looms, creating fabrics of such beauty that they seemed to capture sunlight itself in their threads. The icon painters mixed their pigments with prayers, creating images of saints and angels that seemed to glow with divine light. In the Mese, the great street that ran from the Golden Gate to the Great Palace, merchants called out their wares in a dozen languages. Greek remained the tongue of learning and administration, but the cosmopolitan nature of the city meant that Latin, Armenian, Slavonic, Arabic, and other languages could be heard in its markets and forums. Constantinople was becoming not just the new Rome, but something unprecedented in the ancient world, a truly international city where East met West in profitable harmony. The 5th century dawned with Constantinople already established as one of the world's great cities. But it was under the reign of Justinian III, beginning in 527, that the city truly became the heart of what historians would later call the Byzantine Empire. Justinian was a man possessed by dreams of restoration, dreams of reclaiming the lost western provinces of the Roman Empire, of reuniting the Mediterranean world under one crown, of creating a Christian realm that would endure until the end of time itself. The emperor and his remarkable wife Theodora transformed Constantinople into the greatest city the world had ever seen. Theodora, who had risen from humble origins to share the imperial throne, brought to the palace a keen understanding of the common people that complemented Justinian's grand visions. Together, they embarked on a building program that would leave their mark on the city for centuries to come. The crown jewel of their construction was the new Hagia Sophia, begun after the Great Fire of 532 that had destroyed much of the city centre during the Nika riots. When those riots had threatened to topple Justinian's reign, it was Theodora who had stiffened his resolve, declaring that purple made a fine burial shroud for those born to rule. The suppression of the riots left 30,000 dead in the Hippodrome, but it also cleared the way for the greatest architectural achievement of the age. Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, the two greatest architects of their time, were commissioned to create something that had never before been attempted. A dome of unprecedented size suspended over a vast space, creating an interior that would seem to touch heaven itself. For 5 years, 10,000 workers labored on the project, using materials gathered from across the empire. Marble came from quarries that had supplied the builders of the Parthenon, while purple porphyry arrived from Egypt, green marble from Thessaly, and black stone from the Bosphorus region itself. When the Hagia Sophia was finally completed in 537, Justinian stood beneath its soaring dome and reportedly declared, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." The great church was indeed a marvel that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The dome appeared to float unsupported above the nave, while light streaming through its windows created an otherworldly atmosphere that moved even the most jaded courtiers to tears. The interior was adorned with mosaics of such beauty that visitors described them as windows into paradise itself. But Justinian's Constantinople was more than a showcase of architectural achievement. It had become the administrative center of an empire that, under his rule, stretched from Spain to Persia. The imperial bureaucracy had grown into a sophisticated machine capable of governing diverse populations across 3 continents. The master of offices coordinated the vast network of messengers and diplomats that kept the emperor in contact with his furthest provinces. The Praetorian prefect oversaw the collection of taxes from lands as different as Italian olive groves and Egyptian wheat fields. The quaestor drafted laws that would govern millions of subjects who spoke dozens of different languages and followed countless local customs. The law itself became one of Justinian's greatest legacies, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great legal code compiled by the jurist Tribonian and his team, organized centuries of Roman legal tradition into a coherent system that would influence legal thought for more than a millennium to come. In the law schools of Constantinople, students from across the known world came to study this new legal framework, carrying its principles back to their own lands and helping to spread Roman concepts of justice far beyond the empire's borders. For a year, wealth that flowed into Constantinople during Justinian's reign was unprecedented. The reconquest of North Africa from the Vandals brought the riches of Carthage and its hinterland back under imperial control. The long war against the Ostrogoths in Italy, though costly, eventually restored much of the peninsula to the empire, along with the revenues of Rome, Naples, and Sicily. Trade with India and China continued to enrich the city's merchants, while the silk monopoly, jealously guarded by imperial workshops, provided luxury goods that commanded astronomical prices in Western Europe. The Great Palace expanded during this period into a complex that covered several square miles of the city's most valuable real estate. New halls were added for different ceremonial purposes. The Hall of 19 Couches for intimate dinners with foreign ambassadors, the Chrysotriklinos with its golden ceiling for the most formal receptions, the sacred palace where the emperor would appear to his subjects in ceremonies that deliberately echoed descriptions of the heavenly court. Gardens filled with exotic plants from across the empire provided settings for imperial leisure, while libraries housed the greatest collection of manuscripts in the world. the imperial court that developed around Justinian and Theodora became the model for royal ceremonial throughout Europe and the Middle East. Every gesture, every piece of clothing, every moment of the emperor's day was governed by elaborate protocol designed to emphasize the sacred nature of imperial authority. Foreign ambassadors reported in amazement how they were required to prostrate themselves before the emperor, who appeared dressed in silk and gold, surrounded by courtiers who moved with the precision of a religious ritual. Yet beneath this ceremonial magnificence, Constantinople pulsed with the energy of a great commercial city. The Macy remained the empire's main commercial artery, lined with shops selling goods from every corner of the known world. The city's guilds had grown sophisticated and powerful, regulating everything from the baking of bread to the production of the purple silk that only emperors were allowed to wear. The Guild of Money Changers had become so skilled that Constantinople's gold solidus was accepted as currency from Ireland to India, its purity and weight guaranteed by the imperial mint. The population of Justinian's Constantinople approached 500,000 souls, making it easily the largest city in the Christian world and rivaling any city of antiquity. The free distribution of bread continued to feed the urban masses, while the public baths provided not just cleanliness, but social centers where citizens of all classes mingled. The hippodrome remained the heart of popular entertainment, though, by Justinian's time, the races had become as much about political expression as sporting competition. The blue and green factions that supported different chariot teams had evolved into something approaching political parties, capable of staging riots that could threaten the throne itself. The city's intellectual life flourished under imperial patronage. The University of Constantinople, founded by Constantine and expanded by his successors, attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean world. Here, the works of ancient Greek philosophers were preserved and studied, while Christian theologians developed the doctrines that would define Orthodox Christianity for centuries to come. The Great Library contained not only Greek and Latin texts, but also works in Syrian, Armenian, and other languages, making Constantinople a true center of learning that preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Religious life in Justinian's Constantinople was intense and all-encompassing. In addition to the Hagia Sophia, the city contained hundreds of churches, monasteries, and holy sites. The relic collections of Constantinople rivaled those of Rome and Jerusalem, including fragments of the true cross, pieces of Christ's crown of thorns, and the remains of countless saints and martyrs. Pilgrims came from across the Christian world to venerate these treasures, adding to the city's cosmopolitan character and contributing to its economy. The monasteries of Constantinople played a crucial role in the city's intellectual and spiritual life. The Studios Monastery became famous for its scriptorium, where monks copied ancient texts and illuminated manuscripts with exquisite artistry. The monastery of St. John of Staudios was known for its theological learning and its role in training bishops for the far-flung dioceses of the empire. Even the imperial family maintained close connections with monastic communities, with many emperors and empresses retiring to monastic life in their later years. Art and architecture flourished in this atmosphere of imperial patronage and religious devotion. The iconographic tradition that would become one of Byzantine civilization's greatest contributions to world culture was developing in Constantinople's workshops and churches. Mosaicists perfected techniques for creating images that seemed to glow with inner light, while ivory carvers produced diptychs and religious objects of extraordinary delicacy and beauty. The silk workshops of Constantinople had become legendary throughout the known world. The closely guarded secrets of silk production, supposedly smuggled out of China by monks who hid silkworm eggs in their walking staffs, had made the imperial workshops the sole suppliers of this precious fabric to the Western world. The emperor's own workshops produced silk of such quality that foreign rulers considered it a mark of the highest honor to receive imperial silk as a diplomatic gift. Music and poetry also flourished in Justinian's capital. The liturgical music of the Eastern Church was developing its distinctive character, with hymns and chants that would echo through Orthodox churches for centuries to come. Court poetry celebrated the emperor's victories and the beauty of the city, while popular songs carried news and gossip through the streets and markets. The emperor himself was said to be a lover of music, sometimes composing hymns that were sung in the palace chapel. By the end of Justinian's reign in 565, Constantinople had reached a height of magnificence that would never again be equaled. The city was the undisputed center of the civilized world, the place where East met West in a harmony of commerce, culture, and faith. From the Golden Horn, where ships from every nation rode at anchor, to the great palace, where the emperor held court in splendor that amazed foreign ambassadors, Constantinople embodied the dreams of its founder and surpassed them. Yet even at this moment of triumph, shadows were gathering that would test the city's strength in the centuries to come. The empire was overextended, its resources strained by constant warfare and massive building projects. New enemies were emerging from the steppes and deserts, while old foes were learning new ways to challenge Byzantine power. The very success that had made Constantinople the wonder of the world had also made it a prize that every ambitious ruler would covet. The plague that struck the empire in Justinian's later years was a harbinger of the challenges that lay ahead. The disease, which may have been the same pestilence that would later be called the Black Death, devastated Constantinople's population and weakened the empire just as it faced new threats from every direction. Yet the city endured, its walls standing firm, its people resilient, its faith unshaken. As the 6th century drew to a close, Constantinople remained the greatest city on earth. But it was a city that would soon face trials that would test every aspect of its strength and character. The golden age of Justinian had established Constantinople as the heir to Rome's glory, but that inheritance would prove to be both a blessing and a burden in the turbulent centuries that lay ahead. The 7th century arrived like a storm breaking over the Byzantine Empire, bringing with it challenges that would test Constantinople's strength as never before. The city that had grown fat and prosperous in the peaceful years of Justinian's reign now found itself at the center of a world convulsed by war, plague, and religious upheaval. Yet it was precisely these trials that would forge Constantinople's character as a city that could endure anything history might throw against it. The first great crisis came from an unexpected quarter. In 602, the Emperor Maurice was overthrown and murdered by Phocas, a centurion whose reign of terror would nearly destroy the empire from within. Constantinople, which had known centuries of relative stability, suddenly found itself subject to the whims of a tyrant whose paranoia led him to execute senators, generals, and civil servants on the slightest pretext. The streets that had once echoed with the sounds of commerce and celebration now knew fear as informers and executioners went about their grim work. But it was the external threats that truly tested the city's defenses. The Persian Empire, under the brilliant leadership of Khosrow II, launched the most devastating invasion in centuries. Persian armies swept through Syria and Palestine, capturing Jerusalem and carrying off the true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic. Egypt fell to Persian forces, cutting off Constantinople's grain supply and threatening the city with starvation. By 626, Persian armies had advanced as far as Chalcedon, just across the Bosphorus from Constantinople itself, where their campfires could be seen from the city's walls. From the north came an even more immediate threat. The Avars, a nomadic people who had built a confederation stretching from the Danube to the Black Sea, allied themselves with the Persians in a coordinated assault on the empire's heart. In 626, the Avar Khagan himself led an enormous army to the walls of Constantinople, supported by Slavic tribes and equipped with the most advanced siege engines of the age. For the first time in its 3-century history, Constantinople faced the real possibility of capture and destruction. The siege of 626 became one of the great epics of Byzantine history, a trial that would be remembered and celebrated for centuries to come. Emperor Heraclius was absent, campaigning in the distant mountains of Armenia against the Persians, leaving the city's defense to the Patriarch Sergius and the patrician Bonus. The walls that Theodosius II had built 2 centuries earlier now faced their ultimate test, as Avar siege engines hurled massive stones against the fortifications, while scaling ladders and siege towers attempted to breach the defences. The people of Constantinople rose to meet this crisis with a courage that amazed even their enemies. Citizens who had never held weapons took their places on the walls beside the professional soldiers of the themes. Monks left their monasteries to join the defense, carrying their precious icons before them as they marched to battle. Women and children worked tirelessly to carry stones and arrows to the defenders, while the city's artisans labored day and night to repair damage to the walls and create new weapons for the fight. The siege reached its climax when the Avars attempted a coordinated assault by land and sea. While their siege engines battered the land walls, a fleet of Slavic boats attempted to force the boom that protected the Golden Horn and attack the seawall, which was lower and less heavily defended than the great fortifications facing the land. But the Byzantine navy, though outnumbered, fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. In a fierce naval battle fought in the confined waters of the Golden Horn, the imperial fleet destroyed the Slavic flotilla, sending hundreds of boats to the bottom and leaving the water choked with the wreckage of the failed assault. The failure of the sea assault broke the spirit of the Avar Confederation. The Khagan, faced with heavy losses and no prospect of success, lifted the siege and retreated northward, his great army melting away as subject tribes deserted to return to their homes. Constantinople had survived its first great siege, and the victory was attributed by the faithful to the intervention of the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, whose robe was carried in procession around the walls during the darkest hours of the siege. Yet even as Constantinople celebrated its deliverance from the Avars, a new and even greater threat was emerging from the deserts of Arabia. The armies of Islam, united under the banner of a new faith, had begun their explosive expansion across the Middle East. Damascus fell to the Arabs in 634, followed by Jerusalem in 638, and Alexandria in 641. Within a generation, the Byzantine Empire had lost 2/3 of its territory and much of its revenue to these new conquerors who combined religious fervor with military skill in ways that proved devastatingly effective. The loss of Egypt was particularly catastrophic for Constantinople. For centuries, the great grain ships from Alexandria had fed the city's population, their arrival each year as regular and essential as the changing of the seasons. Now those ships came no more, and Constantinople faced the prospect of famine. The free distribution of bread, which had been a cornerstone of imperial policy since Constantine's time, had to be drastically reduced. Riots erupted in the Hippodrome as hungry citizens demanded that the emperor find some solution to their plight. Emperor Constans II, who ruled from 641 to 668, faced the unenviable task of governing an empire that had shrunk to a fraction of its former size, while defending a capital that remained a tempting target for every ambitious conqueror. The emperor was forced to implement new tax policies that placed crushing burdens on the remaining provinces, while reorganizing the army into the theme system that would characterize Byzantine military organization for centuries to come. This theme system represented a fundamental transformation of Byzantine society. Instead of maintaining professional armies supported by taxes collected from civilian populations, the empire now granted land to soldier farmers who were expected to support themselves while serving as part-time warriors. These themes, or military districts, became largely self-sufficient units capable of defending themselves even when cut off from Constantinople. The system ensured that the empire could continue to field effective armies, even when the central government was weakened. But it also began the process of decentralization that would eventually lead to the empire's fragmentation. Constantinople itself had to adapt to these new realities. The massive bureaucracy that had administered an empire stretching from Spain to Mesopotamia was drastically reduced, with thousands of civil servants losing their positions. The Great Palace, which had once housed a court rivaling that of ancient Persia in its magnificence, became a more modest establishment as imperial revenues dwindled. Many of the city's great monuments fell into disrepair, as funds for maintenance were diverted to more pressing military needs. Yet Constantinople's commercial importance actually increased during this period of political crisis. As the Mediterranean world fragmented under the impact of Islamic conquest, the city became an even more crucial hub for trade between East and West. Merchants who could no longer travel safely through Syria and Palestine were forced to find alternative routes, many of which led through Constantinople. The city's workshops continued to produce luxury goods that commanded high prices throughout Europe, while its position as the gateway to the Black Sea trade became more valuable than ever. The religious life of Constantinople also underwent significant changes during the 7th century. The loss of Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch, 3 of Christianity's 5 great patriarchal sees, left Constantinople as the undisputed center of Eastern Christianity. The Patriarch of Constantinople now found himself the spiritual leader of all Orthodox Christians who remained under Byzantine rule, a responsibility that carried both great honor and enormous challenges. The century also saw the beginning of the great theological controversy over iconoclasm that would divide the empire for more than a century. The question of whether religious images should be venerated or destroyed as idolatrous became a political, as well as theological issue, with emperors, patriarchs, monks, and common citizens taking passionate positions on both sides of the debate. Constantinople's churches and monasteries became battlegrounds in this spiritual war, with mosaics destroyed and restored repeatedly as imperial policy shifted back and forth. Through all these trials, the physical city of Constantinople endured. The great walls built by Theodosius II continued to protect the population from external enemies, while the city's harbours remained busy with the ships of merchants who adapted to changing political circumstances with the flexibility that had always characterized Mediterranean commerce. The Hagia Sophia continued to dominate the city's skyline, its great dome a symbol of Byzantine resilience that could be seen from far out at sea by approaching travelers. The population of Constantinople during this troubled century probably numbered between 300,000 and 400,000 souls, making it still one of the largest cities in the world, despite the empire's reduced circumstances. The city's cosmopolitan character persisted, with Greek remaining the language of administration and high culture, while dozens of other languages could be heard in the markets and streets. Refugees from the lost provinces brought new skills and perspectives to the city, while foreign merchants continued to maintain permanent communities in the commercial quarters. Education and learning survived the political upheavals, though in reduced circumstances. The University of Constantinople continued to train civil servants and clergy, while private schools taught the children of wealthy families the classical curriculum that had been standard for centuries. Monastic schools preserved manuscript, traditions, and theological learning, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of the ancient world would not be entirely lost during these turbulent times. As the 7th century drew to a close, Constantinople had survived its first great age of crisis. The city had been besieged, starved, and impoverished, yet it endured. Its walls remained intact, its harbours still welcomed ships from distant lands, and its churches continued to echo with the prayers of the faithful. The empire had lost much of its territory and wealth, but its heart continued to beat strongly on the shores of the Bosphorus. The challenges of the 7th century had transformed Constantinople from the centre of a great Mediterranean empire into something new, the capital of a more compact but also more unified state that would prove remarkably resilient in the face of future challenges. The city had learned to endure, to adapt, to find strength in adversity. These lessons would serve it well in the centuries to come, when even greater trials would test the mettle of the Queen of Cities. Looking eastward from the walls of Constantinople as the century ended, observers could see the campfires of Araby, armies that remained a constant threat to the empire's remaining territories in Asia Minor. To the north, Slavic tribes continued to probe the Danube frontier, while to the west, the emergence of new barbarian kingdoms meant that the empire's remaining Italian possessions lived under constant threat. Yet Constantinople itself remained secure behind its walls, a beacon of civilization in an increasingly fragmented world, preparing for whatever storms the future might bring. The winter wind carried whispers of destiny across the frozen waters, of the Golden Horn, where ice formed like crystal tears upon the ancient stones. In the depths of Ottoman camps, where braziers cast dancing shadows upon canvas walls, Mehmed II stood before maps that held the weight of empires. His fingers traced the contours of Constantinople's walls, those mighty fortifications that had stood for over 1,000 years. And in his dark eyes burned the fire of a dream that would reshape the world. The young Sultan, barely 21 years of age, possessed a mind that moved like quicksilver through the labyrinth of warfare and statecraft. While snow fell silent as prayer upon the Anatolian hills, his engineers labored by torchlight, their hammers ringing against iron in rhythms that echoed like distant thunder. They were forging something the world had never seen, cannons of such immense size that their very conception defied the imagination of lesser men. In the workshops of Adrianople, where sparks flew like fallen stars, the Hungarian engineer Orban bent over his calculations with the devotion of a monk transcribing sacred texts. His hands, blackened by soot and scarred by molten metal, shaped the instruments of siege with mathematical precision. The great cannon that emerged from his forge was a monument to human ambition. A bronze beast, 27 feet in length, its mouth wide enough to swallow a man, its voice destined to speak the language of empire's end. As winter surrendered to the tentative embrace of spring, the Sultan's army began its pilgrimage toward the Queen of Cities. They moved like a vast river of humanity, their banners unfurling in the wind like the wings of countless birds of prey. Janissaries marched in perfect formation, their white felt caps bobbing in unison, their scimitars glinting in the pale sunlight. Behind them rolled the great guns, drawn by teams of oxen whose breath formed clouds in the cool morning air. The earth trembled beneath the weight of 100,000 feet, and the very stones seemed to whisper of the approaching storm. Villages along the route emptied like autumn leaves scattered by wind, their inhabitants fleeing toward the safety of distant hills. Only the elderly remained, standing in doorways like sentinels of memory, watching the tide of war flow past their homes, with eyes that had seen too much of history's cruel repetitions. Within Constantinople's walls, the Emperor Constantine IV, Palaiologos walked the ramparts as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. His purple robes, faded now with age and worn by the weight of responsibility, fluttered in the morning breeze as he gazed eastward toward the approaching destiny. In his weathered hands, he held a letter from his brother in the Peloponnese, words of encouragement that felt as fragile as autumn leaves in the face of the coming tempest. The city below stirred to life like a great beast awakening from troubled dreams. In the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter, Genoese merchants counted, their coins with nervous fingers, their eyes constantly turning toward the harbour where their ships lay anchored, ready for swift departure. The Venetian traders spoke in hushed tones of contracts that might never be fulfilled, of warehouses that could become tombs, of fortunes that hung in the balance of history's scales. In the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, where centuries of prayer had worn smooth the marble floors, Orthodox priests moved through their morning rituals with hands that trembled not from age, but from the knowledge that each service might be their last in this sacred space. The great dome above seemed to catch and hold their whispered prayers, as if the very architecture conspired to preserve their words for eternity. The city's defenders numbered fewer than 7,000 able-bodied men, a handful of souls to guard, walls that stretched for miles along the shore and land. Among them stood Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese condottiere, whose reputation as a defender of cities had drawn him across the sea to this final stand. His weathered face bore the scars of a dozen sieges, and his eyes held the calm certainty of a man who had long ago made peace with death's inevitability. As the days shortened and the Ottoman army drew closer, the great chain that guarded the Golden Horn was raised with ceremony and solemnity. The massive links, each forged with the skill of master craftsmen, stretched across the harbour's mouth like a bridge of iron, gleaming in the sunlight as if made of liquid silver. It was the city's greatest defence, the guardian of its harboured fleet, the last barrier between the imperial navy and destruction. In the imperial palace, where mosaics told stories of vanished glory, Constantine gathered his council for what all knew might be their final deliberation. The great hall, once filled with the pageantry of empire, now echoed with the hushed voices of desperate men. Maps covered the ancient tables, their parchment surfaces marked with the positions of cannon and the placement of men, as if the very act of drawing lines could hold back the tide of inevitability. The emperor's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 11 centuries of Byzantine rule. His words fell like drops of water into the vast silence of history, each syllable measured and deliberate. He spoke of honour and duty, of the sacred trust passed down through generations of purple-born rulers, of the city that had stood as the bastion of Christianity when darkness covered the earth. His listeners bowed their heads, not in submission, but in recognition of the moment's terrible gravity. Through the city streets, ordinary citizens continued their daily routines with the determined normalcy of those who refused to acknowledge. Approaching catastrophe, bakers kneaded their dough with steady hands, though flour grew scarce and the future uncertain. Mothers sang lullabies to their children, weaving dreams and hopes into melodies that drifted through windows like benedictions upon the troubled air. In the monasteries scattered throughout the city, monks copied manuscripts with renewed urgency, their quills scratching against parchment in a race against time. They understood, perhaps better than the soldiers on the walls, that they were the guardians of more than stone and mortar. In their careful script lay the accumulated wisdom of ages, the philosophical treasures of a civilization that had bridged the ancient and medieval worlds. The great library of Constantinople, repository of texts that had survived the burning of Alexandria and the collapse of Rome, became a temple of quiet desperation. Scholars worked by candlelight, copying the most precious volumes, preparing to smuggle the essence of Byzantine learning to safety in distant lands. Their ink-stained fingers moved with the reverence of priests administering last rites to a dying civilization. As April's gentle rains awakened the earth from winter's slumber, the Ottoman vanguard appeared on the horizon like a dark cloud pregnant with lightning. The great cannons rolled forward on their massive carriages, their bronze mouths speaking silently of the destruction they carried within their iron hearts. Behind them marched the Sultan's engineers, men whose minds had unlocked the secrets of gunpowder and trajectory, mathematics and metallurgy combined in service of conquest. Mehmed II established his pavilion within sight of the Theodosian walls, those ancient fortifications that had weathered sieges beyond counting. The red silk of his tent fluttered in the spring breeze like a banner of war, While inside, the young sultan studied the defenses with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. His generals gathered around him, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps, their voices murmuring strategies that would echo through the corridors of time. The great cannon of Auburn was positioned with the care of a master artist, placing a final brushstroke upon his masterpiece. Teams of oxen strained against its weight, while engineers calculated angles and distances with instruments of brass and wood. The monster weapon seemed to possess a presence all its own, a sleeping dragon of bronze and iron that would soon wake to reshape the world with its terrible voice. From the walls of Constantinople, the defenders watched the Ottoman preparations with the fascination of those witnessing their own approaching doom. The great guns arrayed against them represented more than mere weapons. They were harbingers of a new age, symbols of the inexorable march of technology and the obsolescence of ancient ways. The knights who had once charged across European battlefields now gazed upon instruments of war that made their courage seem quaint and their armor as fragile as parchment. The first bombardment began on a morning when the sun rose blood-red through the smoke of cooking fires and the haze of anticipation. The great cannons spoke with a voice like the crack of doom, its roar echoing across the Golden Horn and beyond, reaching the ears of fishermen on distant shores who crossed themselves and whispered prayers for the souls of the doomed. The stone, cannonball, weighing as much as a horse, flew through the air with a sound like ripping silk before striking the ancient walls with the force of a falling mountain. Where the projectile struck, stones that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust and fragments. The Theodosian walls, which had turned back Attila the Hun and countless other conquerors, groaned under the impact like a living thing in pain. Mortar that had been mixed by craftsmen dead for 1,000 years cascaded down in streams of white powder, while the defenders above felt the very foundations of their world shake beneath their feet. Yet the walls did not fall. Built by engineers who understood that fortifications must bend rather than break, the ancient battlements absorbed the cannon's fury with stolid resilience. The outer face might crumble, but the inner core remained intact, held together by a binding agent that had proven stronger than time itself. The Byzantine engineers of old had built for eternity, and their work now stood as the last barrier between two worlds. Day after day, the bombardment continued with the regularity of a clockwork mechanism. The great guns fired in sequence, their bronze throats belching flame and smoke while their bronze bodies recoiled like living beasts feeling the kick of their own power. The air grew thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the choking dust of pulverized stone, while the constant thunder of artillery made normal conversation impossible. The defenders worked through the night to repair the damage, carrying stones and timber through the darkened streets like ants rebuilding their disturbed hill. Women and children joined the effort, their hands bloodied by rough stone and their backs bent under loads that would have challenged strong men. In the hospitals, physicians tended to wounds caused not by sword or arrow, but by flying fragments of their own city's walls. In the Ottoman camp, the Sultan's other preparations proceeded with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Engineers constructed fascines and gabions, movable shields of woven wood and earth that would protect the advancing troops. Sappers began digging tunnels beneath the walls, their dark passages reaching like fingers of doom toward the foundations of the city. Above ground, carpenters built towers and bridges, siege equipment that would allow the attackers to surmount the barriers that had protected Constantinople for so long. The Ottoman fleet, meanwhile, had encountered an unexpected obstacle. The great chain across the Golden Horn held firm, its iron links defying every attempt to break or circumvent them. The Sultan's ships patrolled the Bosphorus like wolves circling their prey, but the harbour remained sealed, protected by that ancient guardian of worked metal and Byzantine ingenuity. It was then that Mehmed II conceived a plan so audacious that his own admirals initially deemed it impossible. If the ships could not pass through the Golden Horn, they would pass over the land itself. In the hills behind Galata, teams of workers began constructing a roadway of greased logs and wooden planks, a pathway that would allow the Ottoman fleet to be dragged overland and launched into the harbour behind the protective chain. The sound of construction filled the night air, the ring of hammers, the rasp of saws, the groaning of rope and pulley, as massive ships were hauled from water to land. The enterprise seemed to defy the natural order, as if the Sultan's will were strong enough to make the sea itself surrender its domain to the ambitions of earthbound conquest. On the morning of April 22nd, 1453, the defenders of Constantinople witnessed a sight that challenged the very foundations of their understanding. As the sun climbed above the hills of Galata, its rays illuminated a scene that belonged more to dream than reality. Ottoman ships, their masts swaying like trees in an impossible forest, were sliding down the hillside toward the waters of the Golden Horn. The vessels moved with dreamlike slowness, their hulls supported by rolling logs that groaned under the unaccustomed weight. Teams of oxen strained against their harnesses while hundreds of men pushed and pulled with ropes thick as a man's waist. The ships themselves seemed to float through the air, their sails furled but their banners streaming in the morning breeze, as if the very laws of nature had been suspended by the Sultan's will. From the walls of the city, the sight struck the defenders with the force of a physical blow. The great chain, their most trusted defense, had been rendered meaningless by an act of engineering audacity that bordered on the miraculous. The Golden Horn, that safe harbour which had sheltered Byzantine fleets for centuries, now bore the crescents and stars of Ottoman banners reflected in its calm waters. The psychological impact of this feat rippled through the city like waves from a stone dropped into still water. Citizens who had maintained their composure through weeks of bombardment now gathered in the streets, their faces turned toward the harbour, where impossible had become inevitable. Mothers clutched their children closer, while old men who had lived through sieges and invasions shook their heads in disbelief at this display of Ottoman ingenuity. In the imperial palace, Constantine V received the news with the stoic acceptance of a man who had already made peace with fate. The emperor's advisors spoke of surrender, of negotiations, of terms that might preserve the city's population, even if its independence was lost. But Constantine's response came not in words but in action. He donned his armour and took his place upon the walls, where his presence served as a silent declaration that the last emperor of Byzantium would not outlive his empire. The Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn immediately set about constructing a bridge of boats across the narrow inlet. The vessels were lashed together with chains and ropes, their decks covered with planks to create a roadway that would allow troops to assault the harbour side of the city. This floating bridge swayed gently with the current, but it held firm, another testament to the engineering skill that had made the overland voyage possible. As the bridge took shape, the defenders realized that they now faced enemies on multiple fronts. The land wall continued to crumble under the relentless bombardment, while the harbour wall, never designed to withstand a serious assault, now faced the prospect of Ottoman troops advancing across the water itself. The city's defences, which had been concentrated along the traditional approaches, were suddenly stretched thin across multiple points of vulnerability. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had become Constantine's most trusted military advisor, moved through the city like a man possessed. He reinforced weak points with whatever materials could be found, positioned his limited troops where they could do the most good, and inspired the civilian population to take up arms in defense of their homes. His voice, hoarse from shouting, orders above the thunder of cannon fire, carried the authority of experience and the desperation of necessity. The bombardment, meanwhile, had taken on a rhythm all its own. The great guns fired in sequence throughout the day, their timing so regular that the city's inhabitants could measure the passage of hours by the sound of their discharge. Between the explosions, the air filled with the smaller sounds of destruction, the patter of falling stone, the crash of collapsing timber, the cries of the wounded being carried to safety. In the monasteries, the copying of manuscripts continued with feverish intensity. Monks worked by candlelight through the night, their fingers cramped and ink-stained, preserving what they could of Byzantine learning before the storm broke in full fury. Some texts were sewn into the linings of garments, others were sealed in jars and buried in secret locations, seeds of knowledge that might germinate in distant soil when the current crisis had passed into memory. The city's churches became centers of both worship and resistance. Priests led prayers for divine intervention, while also organizing the distribution of food and medical supplies. The great dome of Hagia Sophia seemed to glow with an inner light as thousands of candles burned beneath its soaring arches, each flame a prayer for deliverance, each prayer a testament to the faith that had sustained the empire through centuries of trial. As April drew to a close, the signs of impending assault multiplied like gathering storm clouds. Ottoman engineers completed their preparations for the final attack, while within the city, every able-bodied person prepared for the battle that would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of the civilization they represented. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages, a clash between the old world and the new that would reshape the map of Europe and the course of human history. The great cannons continued their work of destruction, each shot bringing the moment of decision closer. The walls that had stood for over 1,000 years bore the scars of this new form of warfare, their ancient stones no match for the terrible voice of gunpowder and bronze. Yet still they stood, battered but unbroken, the last barrier between the defenders and the storm that gathered beyond. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed II made his final preparations for the assault that would either crown him with immortal glory or cast him into the ranks of failed conquerors. His generals gathered around him in the red silk pavilion, their maps spread before them, like the pages of destiny itself. The young sultan's eyes burned with the fire of ambition as he gave the orders that would set in motion the machinery of conquest, the commands that would determine whether the crescent or the cross would fly above the domes of Constantinople when the sun next set upon the Queen of Cities. The stage was set, the players in position, the great drama of history ready to unfold. In a few hours, the fate of an empire would be decided, and the world would be forever changed by the outcome of a single day's fighting. The last act of the Byzantine Empire was about to begin, and with it, the dawn of a new age in the history of human civilization. The nights had grown shorter, not through the turning of seasons, but through the sleeplessness that gripped every soul within Constantinople's walls. The great cannons of Orban spoke their thunder at dawn each day, and their voice had become the city's heartbeat, a rhythm of destruction that measured the passage of time not in hours, but in the slow crumbling of stone that had stood for 1,000 years. From his position along the great land wall, Constantine watched the Ottoman encampment stretch beyond the horizon like a living sea of silk and steel. The Sultan's pavilions rose in ordered rows, their colourful banners snapping in the spring wind that carried the scent of gunpowder and the distant Bosphorus. Between the camps, the massive artillery pieces squatted like sleeping giants, their bronze mouths pointed toward the heart of his empire with patient, implacable hunger. The great cannon, Orban's masterpiece, dominated the Ottoman battery like a mountain among hills. Its bore stretched wide enough for a man to crawl through, and when it spoke, the earth trembled from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. Each morning brought the ritual of its firing, the careful loading of the massive stone ball, the precise measurement of powder, the slow, deliberate process that preceded devastation. Then came the flash, the thunder that shook the foundations of the world, and the terrible whistle of the stone as it arced through the morning air toward its appointed target. The walls bore the scars of these daily assaults like ancient warriors, bearing their wounds with dignity. Where the great stones struck, the masonry cracked and crumbled, sending cascades of rubble into the fosse below. The defenders worked through each night like ants rebuilding their hill, hauling stones and timber, mixing mortar by torchlight, racing against the dawn that would bring fresh destruction. Their hands bled, their backs arched, but they worked with the desperate energy of men who knew that each stone replaced might buy another day, another hour, another heartbeat for their dying city. Giovanni Giustiniani moved among the defenders, like a living talisman of hope, his Genoese voice carrying across the ramparts with words of encouragement that seemed to push back the darkness. His men had arrived as mercenaries, drawn by the promise of Byzantine gold, but something deeper held them now, a recognition that they defended more than walls and treasure. They defended the idea that a handful of brave souls could stand against the tide of history itself, that courage could matter more than numbers, that the human spirit could defy the inevitable for as long as strength remained in mortal bones. The artillery duel that developed between the Ottoman batteries and the city's ancient cannon created a deadly music that played from sunrise to sunset. The Byzantine guns, old and few, answered the Ottoman thunder with their own defiant roar, their smaller voices crying out against the overwhelming chorus of their enemies. But for every Ottoman piece that fell silent under Byzantine fire, Two more seemed to take its place, dragged forward from the vast supply trains that stretched back toward Adrianople like the tail of some enormous dragon. In the arsenal of the Golden Horn, the last shipwrights of Byzantium worked by candlelight, their adzes and hammers ringing against wood that had been seasoned in the warehouses of emperors. They built fireships with the devotion of monks, illuminated manuscripts, each vessel crafted not merely to burn, but to carry the desperate hope of a people who had run out of miracles. The ships were small, fast, designed to slip through the Ottoman blockade in the dark hours before dawn, when the enemy sentries drowsed at their posts and the wind carried the scent of the sea instead of smoke. The Ottoman fleet rode at anchor across the mouth of the Golden Horn like a forest of masts, their hulls dark against the morning light, their crews moving with the confidence of conquerors who held the sea as surely as their brothers held the land. Admiral Baltoğlu's flagship dominated the formation, its deck bristling with the new weapons that had revolutionized naval warfare. Cannon that could shatter the sides of enemy vessels, firearms that turned every sailor into a marksman, Greek fire projectors that could engulf an approaching ship in flames before its crew could close for boarding. Yet even as the Ottoman noose tightened around Constantinople, the sea lanes remained partially open, thin threads of communication that connected the dying city to the wider world. Through these channels came rumors of relief forces gathering in Genoa and Venice, of papal fleets preparing to sail from Rome, of Hungarian armies marching south toward the Danube. The rumors spread through the city like whispered prayers, growing larger and more hopeful with each telling, transforming from possibility to certainty in the hearts of people who needed hope more than bread. The emperor knew better than to place faith in such rumors, but he allowed them to spread unchallenged, understanding that hope could be as powerful as gunpowder when properly deployed. In the quiet hours of the night, when he walked the walls alone save for his shadow and his thoughts, Constantine faced the mathematical certainty of his situation with the clarity that comes only to those who have accepted their fate. The walls would fall, not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but inevitably. The question was not whether, but when and what manner of ending he could craft from the materials at hand. The city's population had swelled with refugees from the surrounding countryside, peasants and nobles alike who had fled the advancing Ottoman forces and sought shelter behind Constantinople's legendary walls. They crowded into churches and abandoned buildings, their possessions reduced to what they could carry, their lives measured in the distances they had travelled to reach this final sanctuary. The streets echoed with a dozen languages, as Genoese. Merchants spoke with Hungarian soldiers, as Venetian sailors shared wine with Bulgarian farmers, as the empire's diversity gathered in its capital for what might be its final chapter. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Patriarch Gennadios led prayers that rose toward the great dome like incense, his voice joining with those of his congregation in hymns that had been sung in this sacred space for nearly 1,000 years. The walls around them bore witness to the empire's history. Mosaics of emperors and saints, inscriptions in Greek and Latin, the accumulated artwork of generations who had believed their empire would endure until the end of time. Now those same walls trembled with each cannon blast, and dust fell from the ancient vaults like tears from heaven. The Ottoman siege works crept closer to the walls with each passing day, zigzag trenches that allowed the attackers to approach under cover while their sappers worked to undermine the foundations of the great towers. The defenders could hear the digging at night, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, as if the city's foundations were being eaten away by some massive invisible termite. Countermining became a deadly game played in darkness, Byzantine tunnelers racing to intercept their Ottoman counterparts in battles fought with picks and shovels in the suffocating blackness beneath the ancient stones. The sound of the great cannon had become so much a part of daily life that its absence created a more profound silence than its presence created noise. When the massive piece fell quiet for maintenance, or when weather made firing impossible, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the thunder that had become as regular as the tide. Children born during the siege would grow up thinking that cannon fire was as natural as birdsong, that the trembling of walls was simply the way the world behaved, that the smell of gunpowder was what spring was supposed to smell like. Mehmed's headquarters buzzed with the constant activity of a military machine operating at peak efficiency. Messages arrived hourly from scouts watching the approaches to the city, from spies within Constantinople's walls, from supply officers managing the flow of ammunition and provisions to the siege lines. The young sultan moved through this organized chaos with the calm confidence of a man who had calculated every variable and found the outcome satisfactory. His beard had grown fuller during the weeks of siege, and his eyes held the distant look of commanders who see beyond the immediate battle to the larger patterns of history. The Sultan's council meetings had evolved into precise technical discussions about angles of fire and rates of ammunition consumption, about the optimal timing for assaults and the coordination of land and sea forces. Gone were the grand speeches about destiny and divine favor. In their place came the mundane but deadly calculations of military engineering. How many stone balls could the great cannon fire before its bronze would crack? How deep should the siege trenches be to provide adequate protection from Byzantine sorties? How much powder should be reserved for the final assault versus expended in the daily bombardment? The Janissaries sharpened their scimitars and checked their firearms with the methodical care of craftsmen preparing for their masterwork. These elite troops had fought from the Danube to the Euphrates, had seen the walls of a dozen cities crumble before their disciplined advance. But Constantinople presented challenges that even their experience had not prepared them for. The city's defenders fought with the desperate courage of cornered lions, and every street, every building, every stone would have to be taken by force from men who preferred death to surrender. Within the city, the defenders organized themselves into overlapping layers of resistance. The outer wall would be held as long as possible, but when it fell, as everyone now acknowledged it eventually would, the defenders would fall back to the inner wall, then to the neighborhoods, then to the individual buildings. Each retreat had been planned and prepared, each fallback position stockpiled with weapons and supplies. If the city must die, it would die hard, extracting a price in Ottoman blood that would make even victory taste of mourning. The great chain that protected the Golden Horn had become a symbol of Byzantine defiance as much as a practical barrier. Forged in the workshops of Italian masters and strengthened with prayers from Orthodox priests, it stretched across the harbour's mouth like a declaration that some things could not be taken by force alone. Ottoman ships tested it regularly, their rams striking the massive links with tremendous force. But the chain held, its strength seeming to increase with each assault, as if the desperation of the defenders had been forged into the metal itself. Food. Supplies within the city dwindled with the measured inevitability of a water clock marking time. The wealthy still ate well, their tables graced with wine from their private cellars and preserved delicacies hoarded against this day. But among the common people, bread had become precious as gold, and mothers counted out grains of barley like misers counting coins. The siege had transformed the most basic acts of survival into moral tests. Was it right to hoard food when children went hungry? Should the strong take from the weak, or should all suffer equally as the city died by degrees? Yet even as hunger gnawed at the city's strength, its spirit seemed to crystallize into something harder than the stones of its walls. Strangers shared their last crusts with one another. Neighbors who had feuded for years found common cause in their shared peril. And children too young to understand the historical significance of their situation played games of siege and defense in the streets, unconsciously preparing themselves for the reality that would soon overwhelm their city. The Ottoman bombardment followed a rhythm as regular as the liturgical hours. The dawn cannonade that announced the new day's destruction, the methodical, midday firing that carved away at specific targets, the evening barrage that sent the defenders to their repairs under cover of darkness. Between these scheduled devastations, smaller pieces fired at random intervals, keeping the city's nerves stretched taut, ensuring that no one within the walls could find complete peace even in the quiet moments. Constantine had taken to wearing armor during his daily inspections of the walls, not because he feared Ottoman arrows, though they fell like deadly rain whenever he showed himself, but because the weight of the steel seemed to help him bear the weight of decisions that no mortal should have to make. Should he order the city's surrender to save the lives of its people? Should he seek terms while he still had something to bargain with? Or should he let the siege run its course to its inevitable, bloody conclusion, trusting that history would understand the choice, even if mercy could not? The emperor's private moments had become increasingly rare, stolen hours before dawn when he could walk the palace gardens and remember what peace felt like. In these quiet interludes, he sometimes encountered other sleepless souls, a courtier whose family had fled to Italy, a priest whose church had been damaged by Ottoman fire, a soldier whose watch had ended but whose worries had not. They would nod to one another in the darkness, sharing the companionship of the wakeful, bound together by their knowledge that each dawn might be their last. The Ottoman siege towers crept closer to the walls like mechanical giants, their wooden frames covered with wet hides to protect against fire arrows, their crews working around the clock to bring them within striking distance of the ramparts. From within the city, these towers looked like moving mountains, their shadows falling across the suburbs like the shadow of fate itself. Byzantine engineers studied them through spyglasses, calculating angles of approach, planning fire attacks, preparing for the day when Ottoman soldiers would pour across bridges thrown from the tower's tops to the city's walls. The great cannon spoke again as the sun reached its zenith, its voice rolling across the spring landscape like thunder from a clear sky. The massive stone ball traced its arc through the blue air, a dark period marking the end of some ancient sentence written in stone and time. Where it struck, another section of wall crumbled into rubble, Another gap opened in the city's defences. Another small piece of the Byzantine Empire returned to the dust from which it had been raised more than 1,000 years before. In the Ottoman camps, soldiers cleaned their weapons and told stories of the battles they had fought and the cities they had conquered. Constantinople would be the greatest prize of all, they knew. A city whose name was legend, whose walls had turned back barbarians and emperors alike, whose conquest would echo through history like the footsteps of giants. They had travelled far to be here, these men from Anatolia and the Balkans, and they understood that they were participants in an event that would be remembered long after their own names had been forgotten. The siege had created its own economy within the Ottoman camps, a system of trade and barter that functioned independently of the distant markets of Bursa and Istanbul. Soldiers traded plunder from captured villages for better weapons. Craftsmen sold their services to officers who wanted custom fittings for their armor. Merchants followed the army like pilot fish following sharks, ready to buy and sell whatever the war produced. The camps hummed with activity that had nothing to do with the siege itself, but everything to do with the human need to create order and meaning, even in the midst of destruction. In the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Patriarch Gennadios led prayers that rose toward the great dome like incense, his voice joining with those of his congregation in hymns that had been sung in this sacred space for nearly 1,000 years. The walls around them bore witness to the empire's history, mosaics of emperors and saints, inscriptions in Greek and Latin, the accumulated artwork of generations who had believed their empire would endure until the end of time. Now those same walls trembled with each cannon blast, and dust fell from the ancient vaults like tears from heaven. The Ottoman siege works crept closer to the walls with each passing day, zigzag trenches that allowed the attackers to approach under cover while their sappers worked to undermine the foundations of the great towers. The defenders could hear the digging at night, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, as if the city's foundations were being eaten away by some massive invisible termite. Countermining became a deadly game played in darkness, Byzantine tunnelers racing to intercept their Ottoman counterparts in battles fought with picks and shovels in the suffocating blackness beneath the ancient stones. The sound of the great cannon had become so much a part of daily life that its absence created a more profound silence than its presence created noise. When the massive piece fell quiet for maintenance, or when weather made firing impossible, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the thunder that had become as regular as the tide. Children born during the siege would grow up thinking that cannon fire was as natural as birdsong, that the trembling of walls was simply the way the world behaved, that the smell of gunpowder was what spring was supposed to smell like. Mehmed's headquarters buzzed with the constant activity of a military machine operating at peak efficiency. Messages arrived hourly from scouts watching the approaches to the city, from spies within Constantinople's walls, from supply officers managing the flow of ammunition and provisions to the siege lines. The young sultan moved through this organized chaos with the calm confidence of a man who had calculated every variable and found the outcome satisfactory. His beard had grown fuller during the weeks of siege, and his eyes held the distant look of commanders who see beyond the immediate battle to the larger patterns of history. The Sultan's council meetings had evolved into precise, technical discussions about angles of fire and rates of ammunition consumption, about the optimal timing for assaults and the coordination of land and sea forces, Gone were the grand speeches about destiny and divine favor. In their place came the mundane but deadly calculations of military engineering. How many stone balls could the great cannon fire before its bronze would crack? How deep should the siege trenches be to provide adequate protection from Byzantine sorties? How much powder should be reserved for the final assault versus expended in the daily bombardment? The Janissaries sharpened their scimitars and checked their firearms with the methodical care of craftsmen preparing for their masterwork. These elite troops had fought from the Danube to the Euphrates, had seen the walls of a dozen cities crumble before their disciplined advance. But Constantinople presented challenges that even their experience had not prepared them for. The city's defenders fought with the desperate courage of cornered lions, and every street, every building, every stone would have to be taken by force from men who preferred death to surrender. Within the city, the defenders organized themselves into overlapping layers of resistance. The outer wall would be held as long as possible, but when it fell, as everyone now acknowledged it eventually would, the defenders would fall back to the inner wall, then to the neighborhoods, then to the individual buildings. Each retreat had been planned and prepared, each fallback position stockpiled with weapons and supplies. If the city must die, it would die hard, extracting a price in Ottoman blood that would make even victory taste of mourning. The great chain that protected the Golden Horn had become a symbol of Byzantine defiance as much as a practical barrier. Forged in the workshops of Italian masters and strengthened with prayers from Orthodox priests, it stretched across the harbour's mouth like a declaration that some things could not be taken by force alone. Ottoman ships tested it regularly, their rams striking the massive links with tremendous force. But the chain held, its strength seeming to increase with each assault, as if the desperation of the defenders had been forged into the metal itself. Food. Supplies within the city dwindled with the measured inevitability of a water clock marking time. The wealthy still ate well, their tables graced with wine from their private cellars and preserved delicacies hoarded against this day. But among the common people, bread had become precious as gold, and mothers counted out grains of barley like misers counting coins. The siege had transformed the most basic acts of survival into moral tests. Was it right to hoard food when children went hungry? Should the strong take from the weak, or should all suffer equally as the city died by degrees? Yet even as hunger gnawed at the city's strength, its spirit seemed to crystallize into something harder than the stones of its walls. Strangers shared their last crusts with one another. Neighbors who had feuded for years found common cause in their shared peril, and children too young to understand the historical significance of their situation played games of siege and defense in the streets, unconsciously preparing themselves for the reality that would soon overwhelm their city. The Ottoman bombardment followed a rhythm as regular as the liturgical hours. The dawn cannonade that announced the new day's destruction. The methodical, midday firing that carved away at specific targets. The evening barrage that sent the defenders to their repairs under cover of darkness. Between these scheduled devastations, smaller pieces fired at random intervals, keeping the city's nerves stretched taut, ensuring that no one within the walls could find complete peace, even in the quiet moments. Constantine had taken to wearing armor during his daily inspections of the walls, not because he feared Ottoman arrows, though they fell like deadly rain whenever he showed himself, but because the weight of the steel seemed to help him bear the weight of decisions that no mortal should have to make. Should he order the city's surrender to save the lives of its people? Should he seek terms while he still had something to bargain with? Or should he let the siege run its course to its inevitable, bloody conclusion, trusting that history would understand the choice, even if mercy could not? The emperor's private moments had become increasingly rare, stolen hours before dawn when he could walk the palace gardens and remember what peace felt like. In these quiet interludes, he sometimes encountered other sleepless souls: a courtier whose family had fled to Italy, a priest whose church had been damaged by Ottoman fire, a soldier whose watch had ended but whose worries had not. They would nod to one another in the darkness, sharing the companionship of the wakeful, bound together by their knowledge that each dawn might be their last. The Ottoman siege towers crept closer to the walls like mechanical giants, their wooden frames covered with wet hides to protect against fire arrows, their crews working around the clock to bring them within striking distance of the ramparts. From within the city, these towers looked like moving mountains, their shadows falling across the suburbs like the shadow of fate itself. Byzantine engineers studied them through spyglasses, calculating angles of approach, planning fire attacks, preparing for the day when Ottoman soldiers would pour across bridges thrown from the towers' tops to the city's walls. The great cannon spoke again as the sun reached its zenith, its voice rolling across the spring landscape like thunder from a clear sky. The massive stone ball traced its arc through the blue air, a dark period marking the end of some ancient sentence written in stone and time. Where it struck, another section of wall crumbled into rubble. Another gap opened in the city's defences. Another small piece of the Byzantine Empire returned to the dust from which it had been raised more than 1,000 years before. In the Ottoman camps, soldiers cleaned their weapons and told stories of the battles they had fought and the cities they had conquered. Constantinople would be the greatest prize of all. They knew. A city whose name was legend, whose walls had turned back barbarians and emperors alike, whose conquest would echo through history like the footsteps of giants. They had travelled far to be here, these men from Anatolia and the Balkans, and they understood that they were participants in an event that would be remembered long after their own names had been forgotten. The siege had created its own economy within the Ottoman camps, a system of trade and barter that functioned independently of the distant markets of Bursa and Istanbul. Soldiers traded plunder from captured villages for better weapons. Craftsmen sold their services to officers who wanted custom fittings for their armor. Merchants followed the army like pilot fish following sharks, ready to buy and sell whatever the war produced. The camps hummed with activity that had nothing to do with the siege itself, but everything to do with the human need to create order and meaning, even in the midst of destruction. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battleground, the Ottoman artillery prepared for its evening bombardment with the same methodical precision that had characterized every aspect of the siege. Powder was measured, charges were set, targets were selected based on careful observation of the day's damage. The great cannon required an hour to load and aim, its massive weight making every adjustment a project requiring dozens of men and complex arrangements of levers and pulleys. The defenders used the predictable timing of the bombardments to their advantage, timing their repairs and movements to coincide with the intervals between shots. They had learned to read the signs that preceded each firing. The sudden activity around the gun positions, the evacuation of Ottoman troops from areas near the target, the moment of stillness that always came just before the flash and thunder. In this deadly dance between attacker and defender, survival depended on understanding the rhythm of destruction and finding the spaces between the beats where life could continue. The city's walls had begun to show not just the scars of Ottoman cannonballs, but the patches and repairs made by desperate defenders working through the night. Timber buttresses propped up weakened sections, rubble filled the gaps where stone had been pulverized, and iron chains bound together blocks that had been cracked but not shattered. The walls had become a palimpsest written in stone and wood and iron, each layer telling the story of another day survived, another assault endured, another small victory snatched from the jaws of inevitable defeat. From the highest towers of Hagia Sophia, Byzantine lookouts could see across the entire panorama of the siege, the ordered camps of the Ottomans stretching toward the horizon, the glint of sunlight on weapon points and armor, the smoke rising from cook fires and forges, the busy movement of an army that had settled in for a long stay. It was a sight that would have inspired terror in earlier generations, but the current defenders had lived with it so long that it had become simply the new landscape of their world, as familiar as the sunrise and almost as regular. The great cannon fired again as the sun touched the western horizon, its muzzle flash lighting up the Ottoman positions like a brief, artificial sunset. The stone ball whistled through the air with a sound that had become as familiar to the city's residents as the call of seagulls or the ringing of church bells. Where it struck, near the St. Romanus Gate, another section of the outer wall collapsed in a cascade of dust and rubble, opening yet another gap that would need to be defended by courage alone when the final assault came. Night fell across the siege lines like a curtain drawn across a stage, bringing with it the different sounds and rhythms of warfare in darkness. The Ottoman camps settled into their evening routines. The calls to prayer that echoed across the encampment, the smell of cooking fires mixing with the ever-present scent of gunpowder, the low conversations of soldiers who had learned to find companionship in shared danger. Within the city, different sounds marked the passage of the dark hours. The scraping of tools as defenders worked to repair the day's damage, the whispered prayers of those who kept vigil in the churches, the footsteps of sentries walking their appointed rounds along walls that grew more fragile with each passing day. The siege had entered a new phase, one where the outcome was no longer in doubt, but the timing remained uncertain. The Ottoman cannon had carved their way through the outer defences with the patient inevitability of water wearing away stone, and soon they would begin their work on the inner wall. When that barrier fell, Constantinople would die. But how it died, whether in flame and slaughter or in some negotiated surrender, remained to be written in the final chapters of a story that had begun with the first foundation stones laid by Constantine the Great more than 1,000 years before. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama playing out below, marking time with the same celestial precision that had governed the rise and fall of empires since the beginning of history. Tomorrow would bring fresh thunder from the Ottoman guns, fresh damage to the city's walls, fresh tests for the courage of its defenders. But tonight, In the space between one day's destruction and the next, the city dreamed fitfully in the shadow of its approaching fate, while the great cannon waited in patient silence for the dawn that would wake it once again to its work of. The defenders moved with the quiet desperation of those who knew their time was measured not in days, but in hours. Giovanni Giustiniani's bandaged arm hung useless at his side, yet he continued his rounds of the walls, his voice hoarse from shouting orders above the constant thunder of Ottoman cannons. Each impact sent tremors through the ancient stones, and with each tremor, the defenders felt the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing upon their shoulders like a shroud of responsibility too heavy for mortal men to bear. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 28, 1453, Constantine V walked alone through the corridors of the Blashanai Palace, his footsteps echoing in chambers that had once resounded with the laughter of imperial courts and the whispered conspiracies of Byzantine politics. The marble floors, worn smooth by centuries of imperial processions, now reflected only the flickering light of oil lamps and the shadow of a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. His purple robes, the colour of imperial authority that had once commanded the respect of kingdoms from the Danube to the Euphrates, now seemed to hang upon him like a burial shroud, beautiful and terrible in its finality. The emperor paused before a window that looked out over the Golden Horn, where the Turkish fleet lay at anchor like a forest of masts against the pale morning sky. Beyond the harbour, the hills of Pera were dotted with the campfires of Mehmed's vast army, each flame a reminder of the overwhelming odds that faced the city. Constantine's reflection in the glass showed a man aged beyond his years, his dark hair streaked with premature grey, his eyes bearing the weight of decisions that would echo through history long after his name was forgotten by all but scholars and dreamers. In the distance, the call to prayer rose from the Ottoman camp, a sound both beautiful and ominous in the morning air. The melodic Arabic phrases, carried on the wind across the waters of the Bosphorus, seemed to compete with the bells of Hagia Sophia, creating a symphony of faiths that would soon be silenced by the thunder of war. Constantine closed his eyes and listened to both sounds, understanding that by the next dawn only one would remain to greet the sun over the great city. The great hall of the Blashanai Palace had witnessed many councils of war throughout the centuries, but none so poignant as the gathering that took place in the early hours of May 28th. The chamber, once capable of holding hundreds of courtiers and dignitaries, now seemed vast and empty, with only a handful of defenders seated around the ancient table where emperors had once planned campaigns that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The frescoes on the walls, depicting the triumphs of past emperors, looked down upon the small group of men who represented all that remained of Byzantine power. Giovanni Giustiniani sat at Constantine's right hand, his wounded arm resting in a silk sling that had been hastily fashioned from a torn imperial banner. The Genoese condottiere's face was pale from loss of blood, but his eyes remained sharp with the intelligence that had made him one of the most feared military commanders in Europe. Beside him sat Cardinal Isidore, whose Latin robes seemed out of place in the orthodox surroundings, yet whose presence represented the desperate hope for Western aid that had never materialized. The handful of other defenders, a mix of Byzantine nobles, Genoese merchants and foreign volunteers, completed the circle of men who would decide the fate of the last remnant of the Roman Empire. Constantine's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries. "Gentlemen," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "we gather not to plan victory, for that hope has long since faded with the morning mist over the Golden Horn. We gather instead to decide how we shall meet our end, whether as cowards, fleeing into the night, or as men worthy of the legacy we have inherited from our fathers and their fathers before them." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of Turkish cannons beginning their morning bombardment. Each impact sent a subtle vibration through the floor, a reminder that even as they spoke, the walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years were being systematically destroyed by Alban's great guns. The bronze cannons, cast in the very foundries that had once produced church bells for Hagia Sophia, now sang a different song, one of destruction rather than devotion. Giustiniani leaned forward, his good hand gripping the edge of the table. "Your Majesty," he said, his Italian accent lending a foreign cadence to his Greek words, "my men and I came here not for gold or glory, but for honor. We have found both in abundance, though perhaps not in the form we expected. The walls may fall, the gates may be breached, but the memory of this defense will live forever in the songs of poets and the prayers of the faithful." Cardinal Isidore nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasped before him in an attitude of prayer. "The union of the churches which we proclaimed in Hagia Sophia may have divided the people, but it has united us in purpose. Whether we pray in Latin or Greek, whether we cross ourselves from left to right or right to left, we all face the same God as we prepare to meet our Maker." Constantine stood and walked to the great window that looked out over the city he had sworn to protect. In the growing light of dawn, he could see the damage wrought by weeks of bombardment. The great Theodosian walls, which had turned back Attila the Hun and countless other invaders, now showed gaps like missing teeth in an old man's smile. The moat, once filled with water that reflected the glory of the imperial palaces, was now choked with rubble and debris, creating a path for the Turkish assault troops, who would soon pour through the breaches. "I have received word," Constantine said without turning from the window, "that ships wait in the harbour to carry those who wish to flee to safety. No man here need feel shame in choosing life over death, hope over despair. The empire is ending, but your lives need not end with it." The emperor's words hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning and emotion. Outside, the sun climbed, higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard, where servants and soldiers moved with the quiet urgency of those preparing for a siege's end. In the distance, the sound of hammering echoed from the walls, where engineers worked desperately to shore up the defences, knowing that their efforts were likely futile, but unable to abandon hope entirely. One by one, the men around the table rose to their feet. Giustiniani was the first to speak, his voice hoarse but firm. "I came to defend this city, and I shall defend it until my last breath leaves my body, or the last Turk is driven from its walls." His words were echoed by the others, each man adding his voice to a chorus of defiance that would have made the ancient heroes of Homer proud. Constantine turned from the window, and for a moment The morning light streaming through the glass seemed to transform him. The purple of his robes appeared to glow with inner fire, and his face bore an expression of such noble resignation that even Cardinal Isidore crossed himself in wonder. "Then we are decided," the Emperor said simply. "We shall make our stand, not as conquerors, but as guardians of memory." When Turkish histories are written, let them say that the last Romans died as Romans should, with honor, with courage, and with the knowledge that some things are worth more than life itself. The council dispersed as the sun reached its zenith, each man returning to his post with the quiet dignity of those who had made peace with fate. Constantine remained alone in the great hall, surrounded by the ghosts of the emperors past and the weight of decisions that would echo through eternity. In the distance, the bells of the city's churches began to toll, not in celebration, but in preparation for the final service that would be held in Hagia Sophia before the great cathedral's voice was silenced forever. Across the Golden Horn, in the sprawling Ottoman camp that stretched from the shores of the Bosphorus to the rolling hills beyond Pera, Sultan Mehmed II stood before a different kind of council. The young ruler, barely 21 years old, but already bearing the weight of dynastic expectations and imperial ambitions, surveyed the gathering of his most trusted commanders with eyes that burned with the fire of destiny. The great tent that served as his mobile palace was filled with the scent of burning incense and the soft murmur of prayers, for the Sultan understood that the morrow would bring either the greatest triumph of his reign or its most catastrophic failure. The tent's interior was a marvel of Ottoman craftsmanship, with silk hangings depicting the victories of previous sultans and carpets woven with patterns that told the story of Turkish migration from the steppes of Central Asia to the shores of Europe. Maps covered every available surface, their parchment surfaces marked with the careful notations of engineers and siege specialists who had spent months planning the assault that would begin with the next dawn. The greatest of these maps showed Constantinople itself, with every gate, every tower, and every weakness carefully marked in different coloured inks. Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier whose family had served the Ottoman dynasty for 3 generations, stood at Mehmed's right hand, his white beard and weathered face testament to decades of loyal service. Though he had once counselled against this siege, believing it too dangerous and expensive, he now threw himself into the preparations with the dedication of a man who understood that his own fate was tied to the success or failure of the enterprise. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of experience and the wisdom of age. "My Sultan," Halil said, unrolling a fresh map that showed the disposition of the Ottoman forces, "our preparations are complete. 150,000 men await your command, from the janissaries of your household guard to the irregulars who have come from every corner of your empire seeking glory and plunder. The great guns of Master Orban have opened 3 major breaches in the Theodosian walls, and our sappers report that their tunnels beneath the moat are ready to be fired at your signal." Mehmed nodded, his young face grave with the weight of command. Despite his youth, there was something in his bearing that spoke of destiny, a quality that had marked great conquerors throughout history, from Alexander to Caesar to Charlemagne. His dark eyes moved across the faces of his commanders, reading their thoughts and fears with the intuition that separated born leaders from merely competent generals. Zaganos Pasha, the Sultan's closest friend and most trusted advisor, stepped forward with a scroll in his hands. The document bore the seal of the chief engineer, and its contents detailed the final preparations for the assault. "The fleet is positioned to prevent any escape by sea," he reported, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. "Admiral Baltaoglu has positioned 73 ships in the Golden Horn, while another 50 guard the Bosphorus approaches. Not a single Byzantine vessel will escape our net." The Sultan walked to the tent's entrance and pulled back the silk curtain, revealing the vast panorama of his army spread across the landscape like a living carpet of steel and flesh. Campfires dotted the hillsides as far as the eye could see, each one surrounded by clusters of soldiers who had come from every corner of the Ottoman Empire. Turks from Anatolia, Arabs from Syria, Bulgarians from the Danube, and even some Christian converts who had embraced Islam and found new purpose in service to the Sultan. The sight was both magnificent and terrible, a testament to the power that a single man's will could marshal when backed by divine providence and human ambition. In the distance, the great guns continued their methodical bombardment of the city. Walls, each shot carefully aimed and timed to maximize the damage to the ancient fortifications. The largest of these cannons, Orban's masterpiece that the soldiers had nicknamed Basilica, required a crew of 700 men to operate and could hurl a stone ball weighing over 600 pounds with enough force to shatter walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The sound of its firing could be heard for miles, a thunderclap that announced the arrival of a new age of warfare. Mehmed closed his eyes and listened to the symphony of his army, the neighing of horses, the clatter of armor, the murmur of prayers, in a dozen different languages, and underlying it all, the steady rhythm of drums that would soon signal the beginning of the final assault. When he opened his eyes again, his face bore an expression of absolute determination. The 29th day of May dawned with a crimson sky that seemed to bleed across the horizon, as if heaven itself wept for what was to come. In the pre-dawn, darkness. The Ottoman camp stirred with the restless energy of an army that had waited 57 days for this moment. Mehmed II stood upon his pavilion's threshold, gazing across the broken landscape toward the city that had defied him, his young face carved with the weight of destiny. The walls of Constantinople, scarred and patched, rose like ancient guardians against the pale morning light, their stones bearing witness to 1,000 years of triumph and sorrow. Within those walls, Constantine the XV Palaiologos moved through, the shadows of his palace like a ghost haunting his own tomb. Sleep had abandoned him completely in these final hours, and his footsteps echoed through corridors that had once resounded with the laughter of courtiers and the rustle of silk. Now, silence pressed against the walls like a living thing, broken only by the distant murmur of prayers from the great cathedral and the soft weeping of women who knew their world was ending. The emperor's hands, once steady upon the reins of empire, trembled as he donned his armor for what he knew would be the last time. The city's defenders gathered in the grey dawn like fragments of a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting the desperate hope that somehow, miraculously, they might hold back the tide that had been building for months. Genoese soldiers checked their crossbows with methodical precision, their faces grim beneath salt-stained caps. Byzantine guards fingered the hilts of swords that had been passed down through generations, feeling the weight of ancestral glory in their palms. Along the Great Wall, men who had been merchants and craftsmen only weeks before now stood shoulder to shoulder with professional soldiers, united in their determination to defend the city that had shaped their souls. Giustiniani, wounded but unbowed, moved among the defenders like a flame in the darkness, his voice carrying words of encouragement that rang with the authority of experience. His Genoese crossbowmen formed tight clusters along the most vulnerable sections of the wall, their mechanical efficiency a stark contrast to the emotional fervour of the Byzantine defenders. Yet beneath their professional demeanour lay the same recognition that burned in every heart. This day would write the final chapter of a story that had begun when Rome first looked eastward with imperial ambition. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Bosphorus in shades of gold and amber, Mehmed's great cannons began their final symphony of destruction. The sound rolled across the landscape like the voice of God rendered in bronze and gunpowder, each thunderous report shaking the very foundations of the earth. The massive stones of Aubur's great bombardment struck the Theodosian wall with the force of falling mountains, sending cascades of ancient masonry tumbling into the fosse below. Dust rose in choking clouds, mixing with the acrid smoke of gunpowder to create a fog of war that seemed to blur the line between earth and heaven. The defenders crouched behind their makeshift barricades, feeling each impact in their bones, in their souls. Young men who had never known war beyond the tales of their grandfathers now understood why veterans spoke of battles with such haunted eyes. The sound alone was enough to break the spirit. The continuous roar of cannon fire punctuated by the crash of falling stone, the screams of wounded men, and beneath it all, the terrible groaning of a wall that had stood for 1,000 years finally beginning to yield to the relentless pressure of a new age. Giovanni Giustiniani stood at the breach, his armour dented and bloodied, watching as sections of the great wall crumbled like sand castles before the tide. His crossbowmen had formed a human barrier behind the falling stones, their bolts finding Ottoman targets with deadly precision. But for every Janissary who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The Genoese commander's tactical mind calculated angles and distances, counting arrows and estimating the time until the wall's final collapse. But his warrior's heart understood that mathematics had become irrelevant. This was now a contest of will against will, of one civilization's dying breath against another's irresistible advance. In the Ottoman ranks, the Janissaries waited with the patient discipline that had made them the terror of Europe. Their white felt caps caught the morning sun as they knelt, in perfect formation, their muskets primed and ready. These were not the wild tribesmen who had first crossed into Europe centuries before, but the refined products of a military system that had transformed captured Christian boys into Islam's most devoted warriors. They had conquered cities from Baghdad to Belgrade, had broken the pride of Hungarian kings and Serbian despots, and now they prepared to claim the greatest prize of all, the city that called itself the heir of Rome. Behind the Janissaries, wave after wave of Ottoman troops stretched back toward their camp, a human sea of steel and determination. Anatolian cavalry held their horses in check, their lances glinting like a forest of deadly trees. Engineers carried scaling ladders and siege equipment with practiced ease. The Sultan's personal guard, resplendent in silk and mail, formed a protective circle around their young commander, who watched the proceedings with the intense focus of a chess master, contemplating his final moves. At the hour when the sun reached its zenith, a great stone from Orban's monster cannon struck the Theodosian wall at its most vulnerable point, and with a sound like the world splitting open, a section of the ancient fortification collapsed entirely. Dust and debris cascaded into the fosse, creating a rough ramp of rubble that led directly into the heart of Constantinople. For a moment, silence fell over both armies as the magnitude of this moment settled upon them. The wall that had protected the city through dark ages and golden periods alike had finally been breached. Mehmed II raised his jeweled sword, and his voice carried across the battlefield with the authority of destiny itself. In the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate, forward! The Ottoman war cry erupted from thousands of throats, a sound that seemed to shake the very pillars of heaven. The Janissaries rose as one, their white caps moving like foam on a breaking wave, and began their advance toward the breach. Constantine V, watching from the wall's remaining height, felt time slow to the pace of a funeral march. Each step of the advancing Ottomans seemed to echo with the footfalls of history itself, carrying the weight of centuries, the dreams of prophets, and the ambitions of emperors. The last Byzantine emperor gripped his sword with hands that no longer trembled. Fear had been burned away by the pure flame of acceptance. Whatever came next, he would meet it as his ancestors had met their trials, with dignity and courage. The first Janissaries reached the breach and began climbing over. The rubble, their disciplined advance meeting the desperate resistance of the defenders. Giustiniani's crossbowmen sent bolt after bolt into the advancing ranks, while Byzantine soldiers hurled stones and poured boiling oil from their improvised positions. The breach became a cauldron of violence, where individual acts of heroism bloomed and died like flowers in a firestorm. A Genoese crossbowman, his weapon broken, drew his dagger and threw himself upon 3 Janissaries, taking 2 with him into death. A young Byzantine noble, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, stood over his fallen friend's body and held back a dozen attackers until overwhelming numbers finally brought him down. Giustiniani himself fought like a man possessed, his sword cutting deadly arcs through the air as he sought to stem the tide pouring through the breach. His voice rose above the chaos, rallying his men with words in 3 languages: Italian commands to his Genoese, Greek encouragement to the Byzantines, and Latin prayers to the God who seemed to have turned his face away from this ancient Christian city. But even as he fought, the experienced commander could feel the inevitable weight of numbers beginning to tell. For every Ottoman who fell, 2 more appeared to take his place, and the defenders' ranks grew thinner with each passing moment. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Giustiniani felt the sharp bite of a Turkish arrow pierce the gap in his armor below his shoulder. The wound was not immediately fatal, but the shock and pain of it caused him to stumble, and in that moment of weakness, doubt crept into the minds of his men. The Genoese commander, seeing the fear beginning to flicker in their eyes, made a decision that would echo through the ages. Rather than risk the complete collapse of morale, he ordered a fighting withdrawal to the inner city, hoping to regroup and establish a new defensive line. But the sight of Giustiniani's retreat, wounded and supported by his men, struck the remaining defenders like a physical blow. The Genoese had been the spine of the defense, their professional competence the foundation upon which the city's hope had rested. Now, watching their leader being carried away, many of the Byzantine defenders felt the last of their courage drain away like water from a broken vessel. Some threw down their weapons and fled toward the harbour, seeking ships that no longer existed. Others stood their ground with the grim determination of men who had chosen death over surrender, but their numbers were too few to hold back the Ottoman flood. Constantine IX, witnessing this moment of collapse from his position on the wall, made his own fateful decision. Calling to his remaining companions, a handful of loyal nobles and guards who had stayed with him to the end, he spoke words that would be remembered long after his empire had crumbled to dust. "It is better to die than to live." With these words, the last emperor of Byzantium stripped away the purple regalia that marked his imperial rank, drew his sword, and descended toward the breach to meet his destiny as a simple soldier rather than a fleeing monarch. The emperor's final stand became the stuff of legend even as it unfolded. Fighting alongside his handful of companions, Constantine disappeared into the chaos of battle, his sword rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a man who had accepted death and found peace in that acceptance. Witnesses would later disagree about the exact manner of his death. Some claimed he fell beneath a janissary's blade, others that he was crushed beneath the feet of the advancing Ottoman army. What remained undisputed was that the last Constantine died as he had lived in these final months, with courage and honor intact, his body lost among the nameless dead who had given their lives for the city they loved. With the fall of their emperor and the retreat of Giustiniani, the organized defense of Constantinople crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide. Ottoman troops poured through the breach in ever-increasing numbers, spreading through the city's streets like floodwater through a broken dam. The great chain across the Golden Horn, that marvel of engineering that had protected the city's harbour for centuries, was finally lowered by Ottoman engineers, allowing their fleet to sail into what had been the defenders' last sanctuary. As Ottoman soldiers spread through the streets of Constantinople, the city that had been the crown jewel of two empires began its transformation into something new and different. The sounds of battle gradually gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant call of muezzins from makeshift minarets, and the soft whisper of prayers being offered in a language the ancient stones had never heard before. Turkish soldiers, exhausted by the day's fighting, moved through the city with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Many of them struck silent by the realization that they were walking through streets that had witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, the great theological debates that had shaped Christianity, and the dreams of countless generations. Mehmed II entered his conquered city on horseback, riding slowly through streets lined with buildings that seemed to hold their breath in the presence of their new master. The young sultan's face betrayed none of the triumph that surely filled his heart. Instead, he wore the expression of a man conscious that he was walking through a museum of human history, surrounded by the ghosts of ages past. When he reached The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia. He dismounted and walked slowly through its doors, his footsteps echoing in the vast space where emperors had been crowned and patriarchs had offered prayers for 1,000 years. Standing beneath the great dome that had inspired architects and awed pilgrims for nearly a millennium, Mehmed is said to have knelt and pressed his forehead to the marble floor, offering a prayer of gratitude to Allah for this victory, while also showing respect for the sacred nature of the space. In that gesture, witnessed by only a few of his closest advisors, lay the seeds of the policy that would define his reign. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul would be not merely a conquest, but a synthesis, a blending of traditions that would create something entirely new while preserving the best of what had come before. The Great Library of Constantinople, repository of thousands of manuscripts dating back to classical antiquity, became a symbol of this complex transition. Some texts were lost in the chaos of conquest, their parchment feeding cooking fires or scattered by careless hands. But many more were preserved, translated, and incorporated into the Ottoman intellectual tradition, carrying forward the wisdom of ages past into an uncertain future. Greek scholars who had dedicated their lives to preserving classical learning found themselves welcomed in the Ottoman court, their knowledge valued by a civilization that saw itself as the heir not just to the Islamic caliphates, but to Rome itself. In the harbour, ships that had once carried the products of Byzantine trade now prepared to sail under Ottoman flags, their holds filled with goods that would connect the new Istanbul to markets stretching from Vienna to Cairo, from Crimea to Cyprus. The city's strategic position, the very geography that had made it invaluable to Constantine the Great and his successors, would continue to make it the pivot point of empires, the bridge between worlds that would define its character for centuries to come. In the weeks and months that followed the conquest, Constantinople began its metamorphosis into Istanbul with a speed that astonished both conquerors and conquered. Mehmed II, now bearing the title conqueror that would define his legacy, proved to be as skilled an administrator as he was a general. Rather than destroying the city's institutions, he adapted them to serve his new empire, recognizing that Constantinople's value lay not just in its strategic position, but in its accumulated wisdom and established networks of trade and governance. Greek Orthodox Patriarch, rather than being executed or exiled, was confirmed in his position and granted extensive autonomy over the city's Christian population. This decision, which shocked many on both sides, established a precedent for religious tolerance that would become one of the Ottoman Empire's distinguishing characteristics. Churches continued to ring their bells, though now they shared the air with the call to prayer. Jewish refugees from Spain, expelled by the Inquisition, found welcome in this new Istanbul, bringing with them skills and connections that would enrich the city's commercial life. The physical transformation of the city proceeded with equal deliberation and care. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, but its essential architecture remained unchanged. The soaring dome that had inspired Justinian's architects continued to inspire Ottoman ones, and the building's Christian mosaics were carefully covered rather than destroyed, preserved beneath plaster for future generations to rediscover. New mosques rose throughout the city, their minarets creating a new skyline, but they were built to complement rather than compete with the existing architectural heritage. In the bazaars and markets, Greek merchants worked alongside Turkish traders, Armenian craftsmen served Ottoman nobles, and Italian bankers helped finance the new empire's expansion. The city that had once been the eastern gate of Christendom became the western gate of Islam. But the transition was far from simple conquest. It was a cultural synthesis that would produce innovations in art, literature, and technology that neither civilization could have achieved alone. Decades passed, and the generation that remembered Constantine V and Giustiniani gave way to those who had known only Ottoman rule. Children who played in the streets of Istanbul spoke Turkish as their first language, but many also learned Greek from their grandmothers, preserving fragments of the old world within the framework of the new. The city's character began to reflect this layered complexity, neither purely Turkish nor purely Greek, neither completely Islamic nor entirely secular, but something unique and unprecedented, a metropolitan identity that drew strength from diversity. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world that reverberated for centuries. In Western Europe, the news was received with a mixture of grief and fear. Grief for the loss of Christendom's eastern bastion, and fear that the Ottoman advance would continue until it reached the gates of Rome itself. Kings and princes who had ignored Byzantine pleas for aid during the siege suddenly found themselves urgently organizing new crusades and defensive alliances, though these efforts would prove too little and too late to reverse the verdict of 1453. Greek scholars who had fled the city during its final years carried with them not just their lives, but the accumulated learning of centuries. Many found refuge in Italian universities, where their knowledge of classical Greek texts helped fuel the Renaissance that was already transforming Western thought. In this way, the fall of Byzantine Constantinople became one of the contributing factors to the intellectual rebirth of Western Europe, the city's death giving new life to learning that might otherwise have remained locked away in monastic libraries. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from the conquest of Constantinople would go on to become one of the most powerful and enduring states in human history, ruling from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula for more than 4 centuries. Istanbul became the capital not just of a political entity, but of a civilization that would leave its mark on architecture, literature, law, and religion across 3 continents. The Topkapi Palace, built on the site where Byzantine emperors had once held court, became the center of an empire that at its height controlled trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. Yet even as Istanbul flourished under Ottoman rule, the memory of Byzantium persisted like a ghost in the city's collective unconscious. Greek families preserved stories of the old empire in whispered conversations passed down through generations. Church ceremonies continued to echo with prayers that had been offered when the city's walls still flew purple banners. In the bazaars, elderly merchants still referred to certain neighborhoods by their Byzantine names, linguistic fossils that testified to the continuity that underlies even the most dramatic historical transformations. The Hagia Sophia itself became a symbol of this complex layering of history. Converted to a mosque in 1453, it served Islamic worship for nearly 5 centuries before being transformed into a museum in the 20th century, and then back into a mosque in the 21st. Each transformation revealed new aspects of the building's character while preserving others, creating a palimpsest of faith and culture that continues to speak to visitors from around the world about the possibility of honoring the past while embracing the present. Standing today on the hills that overlook the Bosphorus, a visitor can still sense the presence of all the civilizations that have called this place home. The water that divides Europe from Asia continues to flow as it did when Constantine the Great first dreamed of his new Rome, when Justinian built his great cathedral, when Constantine V made his final stand, and when Mehmed II knelt in prayer beneath Hagia Sophia's soaring dome. The geography remains constant while the human stories change, each generation adding new layers to the accumulated sediment of memory that defines this place. The stones themselves seem to hold these memories, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, their surfaces bearing the marks of countless hands that have touched them in prayer, in celebration, in sorrow, and in hope. A fragment of the Theodosian wall still stands, its ancient masonry a testament to the skill of Byzantine engineers and the determination of those who sought to defend what they held dear. Tourists photograph these ruins, trying to capture something of their significance. But the real story lies not in the stones, but in the human hearts that once beat with passion and fear within their protection. In the museums of Istanbul, artifacts from the Byzantine period rest alongside Ottoman treasures, creating displays that tell the story of continuity and change that defines all human civilization. A Byzantine crown sits near an Ottoman kaftan, both objects beautiful in their own right, both representing the dreams and aspirations of people who are long dead, but whose hopes and fears we can still recognize as our own. These objects speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that while empires rise and fall, the fundamental human experiences of love, loss, ambition, and mortality remain constant. The call to prayer that echoes from Istanbul's minarets 5 times each day carries within it not just the voice of Islamic faith, but the accumulated spiritual longing of all who have sought the divine in this place. Christian prayers once offered here did not vanish when the city became Islamic. They became part of the spiritual atmosphere that continues to draw pilgrims and seekers from around the world. The sacred persists across religious boundaries, finding new expression while honoring old truths. In the end, the fall of Constantinople was not simply the end of one empire and the beginning of another. It was a reminder that all human institutions are temporary, that what seems permanent and eternal to one generation may seem fragile and fleeting to the next. The city that called itself the New Rome discovered, as the original Rome had discovered centuries before, that even the mightiest walls cannot hold back the tide of historical change when its time has come. Yet in that recognition of impermanence lies a deeper truth that transcends the rise and fall of particular kingdoms and empires. The courage of Constantine V, facing certain death rather than abandoning his post, speaks to something timeless in the human spirit, the capacity for honor and duty that elevates us above mere survival. The wisdom of Mehmed II, choosing synthesis over destruction, preserving what was valuable from the past while building something new for the future, offers a model for how civilizations might learn from one another rather than simply replacing one another. The streets of modern Istanbul carry forward this legacy of complexity and synthesis, Coffee shops where Turkish, Kurdish, Arabic, and English blend in easy conversation sit next to bookstores selling works in a dozen languages. Artists draw inspiration from both Islamic calligraphy and Byzantine mosaics, creating new forms of beauty that honor multiple traditions simultaneously. Restaurants serve dishes that blend flavors from across the former Ottoman domains, creating a cuisine that is distinctly Istanbulite while drawing from Greek, Armenian, Arabic, and Turkish roots. Children playing in the city's parks speak languages their great-grandparents might not have understood, but they play games that would be recognizable to children from any century. The fundamental human impulses toward joy, discovery, and connection transcend the political boundaries that divide one age from another. In their laughter, something of the spirit that animated the dreams of Constantine, Justinian, Constantine V, and Mehmed II continues to find expression, adapted to new circumstances, but essentially unchanged. The Bosphorus flows on, carrying ships that connect this ancient crossroads to the wider world, just as it has for millennia. The water that witnessed the triumph of Constantine the Great and the fall of Constantine the Film now reflects the lights of modern Istanbul, a city that has learned to be simultaneously Turkish and cosmopolitan, Islamic and diverse, proud of its Ottoman heritage while honoring its Byzantine past. In the gathering dusk, when the last call to prayer fades away and the city settles into the quiet rhythms of evening, one can almost hear the whisper of all the voices that have ever spoken in this place. The prayers of Christian emperors and Ottoman sultans, the songs of Greek fishermen and Turkish poets, the dreams of merchants and the hopes of pilgrims, they blend together into a symphony of human longing that rises from the stones and water, a testament to the continuity that underlies all apparent change. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. But the deeper truth it reveals is that all such endings are also beginnings. All such deaths are also births. What died in 1453 was not the human capacity for greatness, for beauty, for wisdom, or for hope. Those qualities simply found new forms of expression, new languages in which to speak their eternal truths. And so the story continues, written now, in Turkish and Arabic, rather than Greek and Latin, but still fundamentally a human story of people seeking meaning, connection, and transcendence in a world that offers both boundless possibility and inevitable limitation. The walls may have fallen, the empire may have ended, but the spirit that built both walls and empire lives on, adapted to new circumstances but never truly defeated. Constantinople fell, but Istanbul rose. Byzantium ended, but the human dream of creating something beautiful and lasting continues. In the space between what was lost and what was gained, between what died and what was born, lies the eternal mystery of historical change, destructive and creative, tragic and hopeful, final and eternal all at once. The stones remember, the water flows, the city dreams new dreams while honoring old ones. And in that continuity, in that endless capacity for renewal and rebirth, lies perhaps the most profound lesson of all, that while empires may fall and civilizations may pass away, the human spirit that creates them is stronger than the forces that destroy them, more enduring than the monuments that commemorate them, more beautiful than the ruins that mark their passing. Here, where Europe meets Asia, where past encounters future, where the possible emerges from the ruins of the actual, the fall of Constantinople becomes not an ending, but a transformation, not a conclusion, but a continuation of the eternal human story that began when people first gathered around fires to tell tales of gods and heroes, of love and loss, of dreams that died and dreams that lived forever. Time moves like the Bosphorus itself, sometimes swift, sometimes slow, but always flowing, always carrying the sediment of memory from one age to the next. What Constantinople was, Istanbul is becoming. What Byzantium dreamed, the Ottoman Empire achieved in different forms. What those civilizations built together continues to shape the world we inhabit. Their combined legacy, a reminder that the human story is larger than any single culture, any single faith, any single moment in time. In the end, silence falls over the ancient hills, but it is not the silence of death. It is the silence of dreams gathering strength for new expressions, of memory preparing to speak in new voices, of the eternal human spirit resting before its next great awakening. The fall of Constantinople echoes still, not as an ending but as a prelude, not as defeat but as transformation, not as the last word but as the pause between chapters in a story that has no final page. The city sleeps, and in its dreams, Constantine and Mehmed walk the same streets, their differences dissolved in the larger recognition that they were both servants of something greater than themselves, the human aspiration toward meaning, toward beauty, toward connection across the boundaries that seem to divide us but actually unite us in our common humanity. In that dream, walls become bridges, conquests become collaborations, and endings become the seeds from which new beginnings grow. Beneath layers of time, beneath the accumulated sediment of centuries, the heart of the city beats on, carrying forward all that it has been, while becoming all that it might yet be. The fall of Constantinople was the end of one dream and the beginning of another, but both dreams drew their power from the same source, the inexhaustible human capacity to create meaning from chaos, beauty from destruction, hope from despair. And so the story continues, as it always has, as it always will, written in stone and water, in prayer and song, in the footsteps of pilgrims and the dreams of children, in the silence that remembers everything and the voice that tells it all again, new and ancient, familiar and strange, ending and beginning, all at once, forever and always, until the stars themselves grow cold and the last tale is told. You've just experienced the complete 25,000-word journey through the fall of Constantinople, a story of empires, courage, and the eternal human spirit. If these timeless tales have moved you, if you found peace in these ancient stories, or if you simply want to continue exploring history's most fascinating chapters, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to Fall Asleep to History. Every subscription helps us continue crafting these immersive historical narratives, bringing you the stories that shaped our world in the soothing, sleep-optimized format you deserve. From the rise and fall of great civilizations to the intimate stories of remarkable individuals, we're here to make history your perfect companion for peaceful rest. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. Sweet dreams, and may history's greatest stories carry you gently into sleep.